Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Standards-Based Informatics Infrastructure to Identify and Manage Patients Eligible for Genetic Evaluation of Familial Cancer Risk webinar. Before we get started, and before introducing our moderator and speakers for today, I would like to review a few WebEx logistics before we get started. All lines have been muted upon entry and will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. You can submit your questions at any point during today's webinar by using the Q&A or chat panel and selecting all panelists from the drop-down menu. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted online in the next few weeks. And with that, I will pass the presentation over to our moderator, Nani K. Shelburne.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited to introduce our two speakers. Kim Kaphingst is a professor in the Department of Communication at University of Utah. Her research focuses on the communication of cancer risk and genetic information using both quantitative and qualitative methods. She recently completed a study to examine educational and support needs for family communication and cascade genetic testing among families with hereditary cancer syndrome. She's joined by Dr. Guilherme, who's a physician and Ph.D. in biomedical informatics at University of Utah. He's currently the Associate Professor and Vice Chair of Biomedical Informatics. His research interests focus on the standards-based clinical decision support interventions, particularly focusing on cancer prevention. They both have working on the currently funded U01 Moonshot grant titled Leveraging an Electronic Health Record Infrastructure to Identify Primary Care Patients Eligible for Genetic Testing in Inherited Cancer Syndromes and Evaluating Novel Cancer Genetic Service Delivery Models. We're thankful for both of them being here today to discuss some pilot work they had completed on trying to use these EHR infrastructures in clinical decision support. This time I'll turn it over to Dr. Kaphingst.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much to the National Cancer Institute for the opportunity to present our work. So as you heard, we are going to be presenting our work on standards-based informatics infrastructure to identify and manage patients eligible for genetic evaluation of familial cancer risk. And the first thing we wanted to do was to acknowledge our funding. This is the work that will be presented is funded by 2 grants from the National Cancer Institute. As you heard, one of them is a U01. The second is a U24, funded through the Informatics and Technology for Cancer Research, or ITCR program. That was a grant to the University of Utah and Intermountain Healthcare. The U01 is a multi-site randomized controlled trial funded through the Moonshot program to the University of Utah and NYU. We wanted to highlight that these 2 grants are really working together in quite a synergistic way. The U24 allowed us to begin the development and testing of the informatics infrastructure that we'll be talking about here today. And then the U01 has allowed us to disseminate that infrastructure to a second site and then to begin to test it in a clinical application. Next slide, please. So this is what we'll be presenting is the work of a large team of people at multiple sites, and we won't introduce everyone in the interest of time, but we did want to highlight a few features of our project teams. So these are some of the key project investigators in Utah. As you can see, it's quite an interdisciplinary team. So we're drawing on multiple departments at the university, but also multiple institutions at Utah and at Intermountain Healthcare. We also wanted to highlight, because this has really been critical to the success of the work to date, that we have strong clinical involvement and clinical leadership involved in the beginning of the project. So we have primary care leaders from the University of Utah healthcare system, as well as specialists in cancer, cancer genetics, and genetic counseling from the Huntsman Cancer Institute. So to highlight just our genetic counselor, Wendy Coleman, who's been essential to this work, our primary care providers, Mike Flynn and Rachel Hess, and then Sandra Baez and Josh Schiffman, who provide leadership in cancer genetics. Next slide, please. And then similarly at NYU, we have an interdisciplinary team that has strong clinical involvement. So primary care involvement from Drs. Eric Goldberg as well as Devin Mann, who's an internist and also an informaticist. And then we have genetic counseling expertise from Rachel Chambers and clinical genetics expertise from Ophira Ginsburg, who serves as the site PI at NYU. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the motivation that really underlies the work that's funded by these two grants is the realization that about 13% of individuals are at increased risk for familial breast or colorectal cancer, but many individuals are unaware of their risk, which provides the opportunity to reach out to people and tell them about their risk and hopefully implement prevention or other clinical management types of strategies. We are interested in seeing whether we can do this working through primary care. It's important to highlight that at the moment, most guidelines for genetic testing recommend risk-based genetic testing rather than going to population screening or population testing. So as we'll be highlighting, our work is closely based on NCCN guidelines or the guidelines of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. There is also a recent B recommendation from the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force that recommends genetic testing for women with a personal or family history of breast, ovarian, tubal, or peritoneal cancer. And so we have really relied on current guidelines to select patients who may be at increased inherited risk of cancer. Next slide, please. So to introduce the Informatics grant, the ICTR U24, the goal of this grant is to develop a clinical decision support or CDS platform to identify individuals who may be at inherited risk of cancer and to manage that risk. This is being done by leveraging family health history information that is already in the electronic health record. By applying algorithms that are based on current NCCN criteria. And I'll show you a little bit about those criteria on the next slide. But we did also want to highlight that really one of the other goals of the U24 is to reduce the burden on primary care, so not to introduce a good deal of other work for primary care providers, but to utilize this CDS platform in order to minimize the effort required. Next slide, please. We will go through the NCCN guidelines in detail, but we adapted the guidelines for breast cancer risk reduction as well as colorectal cancer risk reduction in developing the algorithms to identify individuals potentially at inherited risk of cancer. To highlight a few features of the NCCN guidelines for those of you who may be less familiar with them, as you can see, there's a great deal of detail based on family relationship, type of cancer diagnosis, age of onset, and potentially having a cancer syndrome in the family. The point we wanted to make is that this is a good deal of information for primary care providers to keep track of. The NCCN guidelines, of course, also change over time as new developments and new research is conducted. And so one of the thinking behind developing the CDS platform and the algorithms is that this allows the computer to keep track of all of these details and identify people who meet NCCN criteria. Next slide, please. These are just the criteria for colorectal cancer. So again, you can see similarly, there's a good deal of detail on cancer syndromes, familial cancer relationships, the type of cancer diagnosis, and age of diagnosis. Next slide, please. So we have had the opportunity to utilize the informatics infrastructure developed through the U24 in our recently funded U01, which is now in its second year. We call the U01 Bridge, broadening the reach, impact, and delivery of genetic services. Its first aim is to identify primary care patients who qualify for genetic risk assessment using a CDS algorithm to automatically evaluate family history of cancer. So as you can see, this is an opportunity to integrate with the informatics infrastructure as well as disseminate it to a second site at NYU. The second aim is then to compare uptake of genetic testing using two different genetic services models, which we call the patient-directed model and the enhanced standard of care model. targeting unaffected primary care patients with the goal of increasing prevention strategies. This is another point for integration with the informatics infrastructure through the patient-directed model, as we'll be describing. And then the third aim of Bridge is to compare adherence to clinical care recommendations as well as patient responses to the different genetic services models. Next slide, please. This is the study flow diagram for Bridge. We will be going over the workflow in greater detail when Guilherme del Fiol presents, but this is to introduce you to the different genetic services models. The first aim is, again, to identify individuals who are potentially at increased risk and to offer, so that we can offer genetic evaluation. That aim has largely been completed. So as you can see, between our two healthcare systems at the University of Utah and NYU, there were about just under 450,000 individuals who fall into the age range of interest, which was 24 to 60. When we ran the algorithm at the two sites, we identified more than 22,000 primary care patients who may potentially benefit from genetic services, meaning that they meet current NCCN guidelines for genetic testing, and that is without collecting additional family history information, again, only using the information already in the electronic health record. For the trial, we are randomizing about 2,000 patients to one of two arms. The patient-directed arm is our intervention arm, and enhanced standard care is the control arm. The patient-directed arm uses an automated approach to genetics education, inviting people to the automated approach through the patient portal. As you can see, pre-test genetics education, as well as return of negative test results among people who decide to test, is done by a chatbot platform. Although we did want to highlight that positive results, as well as a variant of uncertain significance, or VUS results, are still returned by a genetic counselor. Our control arm, the enhanced standard of care arm, is largely standard of care genetic counseling, pre-test and post-test counseling done either in person or by telephone, which differs between our two systems. What makes it an enhanced arm is that we are actively outreaching through a genetic counseling assistant to individuals identified by the algorithm as potentially benefiting from genetic testing. For the third aim, we have two follow-up questionnaires, a 4-week and a 12-month questionnaire after genetic testing. The 4-week questionnaire will allow us to look at things like satisfaction with counseling and people's reactions to the chatbot approach, as well as their responses to testing. And then 12 months allows us to look at adherence to clinical recommendations, and we will also be abstracting data from the electronic health record. Next slide, please. This is to give you a little more detail on our patient-directed approach, which is, again, an invitation that people receive to complete a chat, which is conducted by a chatbot we call GIA, the Genetics Information Assistant. We partnered with Clear Genetics, which is now part of Invitae, to develop the platform. We spent a good deal of time scripting what GIA says to be as close as possible to what our genetic counselors say when they deliver this information. So what you're seeing in the gray boxes are the script that is delivered by the automated assistant. In this particular slide, what she's talking about is that family history may put people at increased risk. The more teal buttons are the responses from the participants. When we put together the script, we decided on a core set of information that we felt like everyone should receive in pre-test, and so the minimum possible information was pre-decided. But there are also options where if people want additional information about specific topics, they can seek that out. So you can see at the bottom of this screen, the participant can say, "Okay, GIA," and they move on to the next topic. Or they can receive more information about this topic by clicking on what kind of things do you think you look for. You also may see that some of the words are underlined. So if you hover over a word like positive or a mutation, you can get a plain language definition of those terms, and that was actually a suggestion by our primary care providers in order to help educate people. Next slide, please. The platform also allows patients to ask questions. So the box that you're seeing here allows people to start typing a question. The platform will suggest particular types of questions that may be what the person is asking, or they can keep typing. We scripted all of the responses to those questions, working as a team with our genetic counselors. If a question is asked that the system doesn't recognize, that is sent to the genetic counseling team by email so that we can respond directly to the patient. And they use a natural language processing system in order to figure out what the participant is asking. Next slide, please. And then this slide shows the initial outcome from the patient-directed arm. At the end of the pre-test genetics education module, we ask the participant whether they are interested in moving forward with testing, and they can respond yes, no, or I'm not sure yet. In all of those cases, because this is a research protocol, are contacted by a genetic counseling assistant who can either assist with ordering a test for those who are interested, answering questions for those who need more information, or assuring that people understand the information if they decline. And now I will turn it over to Guilherme del Fiol, who will go through some of the details of the workflow.
Thank you, Kim. So we're going to talk about the steps involved in the workflow, both for the standard outreach arm and the chatbot arm, or patient-directed arm. And then I'm going to talk about the underlying system architecture, the software components that we developed for this project as a part of our U24 grant, and how we integrate our infrastructure with EHR systems, in our specific case, Epic. So in the standard outreach, we have our population-based algorithm that's running. Currently, it runs once a week on Sundays. It basically fetches the data from the EHR using the HL7 FHIR standard. FHIR is an emerging data standard for EHRs that's being quickly adopted by many EHR systems out there, and it became a high priority for the NIH recently. So we fetch all the data we need for all the target population. That's done in one call to basically make the process more efficient. Then for patients who meet criteria, NCCN criteria, that's just one example right there. Patients who do not meet criteria, we're done with them. Those who meet criteria are put in a queue in a population health management platform within the EHR. And then genetic counseling assistant starts working with those patients. The first thing they do is to send us a message to the PCP, primary care provider staff, as a heads up that outreach messages will be sent to this patient regarding this issue. And that's just so the clinic knows what to do in case the patient calls with questions. Next, they also use the same population health management platform that I'm going to show in a minute. But they basically send electronic messages through the patient portal about this situation and inviting the patient, suggesting the patient to call the clinic and set up an appointment. If the patient doesn't respond, eventually a genetic counseling assistant will try to outreach via phone call. If the patient agrees to genetic counseling, then we have an appointment, just as in usual healthcare workflow. And at the end of the appointment, a genetic counselor will create a note in the EHR with the clinical recommendations for the primary care provider is copied on that note, and they also add entries to the problem list and medical history to reflect what they found in that encounter. So that's usual care. So next step, I'm going to talk about the self-directed or patient-directed arm, where we have two stages. First, we have the pre-test chatbot. So that's done as the first outreach attempt to patients. We have the same initial workflow. So the boxes in gray are identical to the usual care. We identify the patients using the same mechanism. We also send a note to the PCP staff so they are aware this is happening. But then this is a little different. Patients still get a message through the patient portal, but instead of asking the patients to call the clinic, they will have a hyperlink that's personalized to each patient. They can click on that hyperlink to launch a chatbot session, just like the screenshots that Kim just showed. So the patient goes through the pre-test chatbot session, and at the end of the session, they'll answer the question whether or not they're interested in testing. This is a point where we integrate the chatbot platform with the EHR. All the chatbot transcript gets eventually saved into the EHR as an encounter, as an outreach encounter, with that script. There's also a follow-up call. When a patient completes the chatbot, there's an indication in the population health management platform that a chatbot has been completed. So a genetic counseling assistant can see all the chatbots that have been completed, and they can go and call the patients to confirm the decision and give them instructions about testing. If the patient confirms that they are interested in testing, they'll receive a kit in the mail to collect a sample, complete the testing, and then the pre-test workflow is completed. So next we have another part of the workflow, which is once we have the genetic testing completed, the results are returned in a usual way to the genetic counseling service. A genetic counseling assistant will review the results of the test. And then we have two options here. For patients who have a negative test, they will receive another patient portal message with another chatbot link, which will go through, will basically explain the results and the implications of the negative test, also via chatbot. Again, at the end of that interaction, a transcript of the chatbot is saved into the EHR as an outreach encounter for documentation, and there's also the genetic counseling assistant will also create an encounter with clinical recommendations with the primary care provider copied. So that's kind of similar to the usual care workflow. On the other hand, if we have a positive test or a variant with uncertain significance, then we do have a genetic counseling appointment as in the usual care workflow. The appointment is followed by, again, an EHR encounter with a note with clinical recommendations for screening moving forward with the primary care provider copied, and also the patient's the findings added to the problem list in medical history. Okay, so this was workflow. Now let's look at under the covers how things work with our architecture and how the data flows in just a little more detail, but without getting too much technical here. So again, as we mentioned before, the first step is to retrieve all the data for all the eligible patients to be evaluated by our platform. So we have this population coordinator component doing all of that. That's part of our system. So it fetches the data using the FHIR standard, and then we evaluate the patients one by one using, again, FHIR to represent the data and the CDS hook standard to communicate with an open source CDS web service that's called OpenCDS. And that's where our algorithms have been implemented. The reason to implement it this way is that we separate all the logic, the family cancer risk algorithm, from all the other components. And what this allows us to do is to integrate OpenCDS with the NCCN-based algorithms from all the other components. And you can imagine other workflows that I'm going to talk about in a minute. We could leverage the same platform for completely different workflows that are, for example, not done in a population-based manner. So OpenCDS will return evaluations for each patient. We'll basically tell whether or not the patient meets NCCN criteria. Patients who do meet criteria are exported to the EHRs. In this case, again, it's EPIC, the EHR's population registry. So we're basically leveraging tools that are available in the EHR. We also, at this point, for patients who meet criteria, we call the chatbot server and retrieve personalized chatbot links for each of those patients. And those links are also stored in the population registry. Finally, we have the outreach step. That's where a genetic counseling assistant interacts with the population management platform in Epic, and they use that to send outreach messages and track the progress of each patient through the pipeline. Okay, this is just to give a little overview on how we integrated the chatbot product with the EHR. Again, we have a patient interacting with the patient portal. They see a message with a personal chatbot link. We explained in the previous slide how we get those personalized hyperlinks. They initiate a chatbot session interacting with the chatbot server. Once the chatbot session is completed, the transcripts are then sent daily through secure FTP. They're basically, the chatbot server is pushing those transcripts in batch, not real time. That's done in batch every night through secure FTP, and then our platform pulls those transcripts into an outreach encounter within the EHR. Here's another alternate point of care architecture. We have not implemented this, but it's very possible to do it. It's just to illustrate different ways into how our platform can be integrated into a clinical workflow. So we have an EHR. It's a much simpler workflow where you might have a medical assistant or anyone at the point of care collecting the patient's family history as they normally do, or using some different methodologies, such as a patient gets an iPad and complete family history, or they do it at home. The point is family history is being collected somehow, and then when the provider opens the patient's chart, you could have a call automatically triggered to our external CDS web service that's maybe sitting on the cloud or on a server within the healthcare organization. And the service basically comes back and tells, okay, this patient does meet criteria, NCCN criteria for genetic evaluation. And at this point, the provider might get an alert or a reminder suggesting genetic testing and a referral to a genetic counseling. Okay, this is just to give an idea of the population health management platform within Epic. There's a lot of blurring in these screenshots because of PHI, but hopefully you'll get the gist of how this works. So I'm going to walk you through the different sections of the screen. The first one is the most important. That's the list of patients who meet criteria. They're all in the registry and have been exported by our CDS form. And there are each of these columns allow filtering, sorting the list of patients. You have things like the patient's primary care provider, the clinic, patient's age, gender, and also a number of statuses in terms of the outreach. For example, you could have a patient who just got added to the registry. Other patients may have completed the pre-test chatbot. Others are waiting for a test result, and so forth. You can right-click on a list of patients to send outreach messages. And down below, you have individual patient data. Once you select one patient, you can get an overview of the patient's record of relevant information that can help with the outreach process. For example, that includes the patient's medical history, the family history, especially the pieces that are relevant for the NCCN criteria, the patient's problem list, and also a history of the outreach attempts related to this whole process. So we didn't have to develop any new technology for this part of the process. We leverage technology that's already available in the EHR. Okay, so this is to summarize the pilot we've conducted in the last year or so. And this was, we piloted initially the usual care workflow. There's a current pilot that just started this week testing the chatbot patient-directed arm. So, and here are the results of the pilot. We ran our algorithm against University of Utah Health target population. And we found about over 5,000 people who meet criteria for genetic evaluation. And we did a pilot with 71 patients. Those were patients assigned to 5 primary care providers who were interested and accepted to be part of this pilot experience. And outreach messages were sent to those patients. In a nutshell, about a third of those patients accepted to set up an appointment. Not all of them have completed the appointment so far. We're still waiting. But for those who completed, you see that we already found 2 people who tested positive for BRCA mutation and ATM. So a couple of lessons learned through this process, through the piloting. The first, we spent about, I don't know, probably about a year trying to understand clinical workflow. That is extremely important. And we spent a fair amount of time visiting all the clinics. We have a human factors social technical team that interviewed medical assistants, primary care providers to try to understand how they collect family history, how they use family history to inform their decisions and their referrals to genetic counseling, and try to understand also variability in the workflow. And with all of that information, also discussing with our genetic counselors and with primary care providers, we refined and finally came up with a workflow that actually, I think, worked pretty well. Again, critical to work very closely with primary care providers and make sure the workflow will be acceptable and making sure we address their concerns. And again, we did a pilot at a small scale. We worried about sending 5,000 messages to patients and not really knowing what could happen, having unintended consequences that could really compromise the success of the project. So we started very small, and there were several valid concerns, but at the end the pilot went very smoothly, and we didn't have any of the concerns that folks raised actually happen in the pilot. We learned a lot in the dissemination to NYU, and we are using standards, EHR standards, to improve interoperability. The dream is plug-and-play interoperability, but we all know that this is not possible currently. You always need some kind of adaptation. The standards really help. We don't have to start everything from scratch, but there are several points that need to be adapted/translated when we try to plug the architecture at another site, even if they're using the same EHR. Okay, so a little more on dissemination. Again, to everything from the ground up in the ITCR program, the whole goal is to try to disseminate this kind of tooling. We follow several approaches to make that happen. First, everything we do is standards-based, and CDS hooks and FHIR are the primary standards that we adopt. We also use open source technology in our platforms. They're all open source. We are providing, again, the infrastructure for the randomized trial, and that's actually improving our infrastructure, making it more flexible and more solid for dissemination to other sites. And as part of our U24, we also have one component that includes dissemination to Intermountain Healthcare, where they use the Cerner EHR. So we are now in the process of adapting our algorithms to Intermountain in the Cerner platform. So in summary, we developed an open source and standards-based platform that helps identify people who meet criteria for genetic evaluation for hereditary cancer risk. We successfully integrated that with Epic and continue to pilot at University of Utah. The chatbot pilot just started. We're planning to roll out the randomized trial to all University of Utah clinics and NYU by the summer 2020. We also explained that the architecture can be used in other workflows. We are using for population health management, but this could be done also at the point of care, patient by patient. We would also like to point out that there are RFAs offered by the NCI that are designed to help foster this kind of collaboration between our U24 and U01. So you can have sites that might be interested in using our infrastructure could submit a proposal in collaboration with us to be able to and use that funding to help deploy our infrastructure at these other sites. So we have a long list of project collaborators and contributors, and with that, we'll like to open for questions.
Thank you both for your wonderful presentation. We do have several questions that have come in. One wanted to start back with how family history information is being collected. So how your system knows the family history information is available, and is it pulling whatever information is available in the EHR, whether it's complete or not?
Yeah, so family history in our approach, family history is collected through usual care. We did not try to change primary care workflow in terms of how family history is collected. It's not perfect. We know that our sensitivity is probably low because of the lack of completeness in family history collection and also the extreme variability we find across sites, but it's sufficient to identify a large number of people, and that will keep us busy for some time. Our platform knows that there's family history basically by scanning the records. So every week, it basically goes and scans the entire target population and basically looks at whatever's available in the record. So if between 2 weeks, we have a couple of patients who went to a clinic and got family history added to their records, our algorithm will pick that up by the end of the week.
Kim, are you seeing any differences among different patient demographics and those that do and do not have complete family history just based on what's being picked up as eligible?
Yes, so we've just started looking at this. We are finding, for example, both sites have a substantial number of Hispanic patients, and we are finding less family history information as well as less complete information among our Hispanic or Latino patients, as well as among our Spanish-speaking patients compared to English-speaking. So we are currently thinking about, how to approach that question so that the algorithm is able to identify people across different population subgroups.
Great. One question was about, you mentioned that you talked to your stakeholders, and what were some of the primary care physician concerns going into this, using this model and the alerts and messaging?
A common concern, a common theme is the concern that these kinds of changes will overwhelm an already overwhelmed primary care setting. And for example, patients receive those messages, they may not understand where is this coming from, and they might defer back to their primary care providers to help explain what's going on here. And so they were worried about getting a flood of telephone calls and messages through the patient portal. I think that was the main one. Kim, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, the other thing we've thought a lot about is management post-testing as well. So the primary care providers knowing how to refer to the genetic services or our high-risk clinics for management of patients who are identified as having a positive genetic result. And we've actually been working on what we call health modifiers, but some of the reminders that patients get so that they are consistent with guidelines for patients who carry mutations. But sort of that transition between specialty care and primary care for people who test positive is another concern and one we've been working to address.
for the 5 physicians that participate in your pilot, has there been any initial feedback?
So from the pilot, we haven't received much feedback, and it seems it might be a situation where no news, good news. We didn't have any unintended consequences with those patients in the outreach process. We did have feedback, especially related to what Kim just said, related to closing the loop back to primary care, how you communicate the findings, genetic testing findings, and the clinical recommendations. That's a pretty complex workflow, and it took changes to genetic counseling workflow and how they do their work. It's a fair amount of work for the genetic counselors to make that closed loop communication happen.
Thank you. What genetic testing lab are you using?
It's actually, it is just the standard of care for the different sites. So it's not a single lab. It just depends on people's insurance and indications for testing. So it's a decision that's made by the genetics team at both sites, but it follows the normal standard of care at the University of Utah and NYU.
Is that the same when it comes to choosing the scope of testing? If someone asked if the patients have any input or options on the scope of testing that you're looking for?
So yeah, that's a good question. So we're recommending a particular multi-gene panel, but that is something that's discussed with the patients either by the genetic counselor or the genetic counseling assistant, depending on which arm they're in, prior to testing.
For the patient-directed arm and individuals who test negative, someone had a question about 2 different scenarios. So what you're doing if negatives were there, for the negatives where there's still a significant family history that puts them at empirical increased risk for cancer, are you able to, with the algorithm, identify those patients?
Yes, so they are still identified through the algorithm based on their family history. And one thing I kind of went over quickly, but people who test negative, those results are still, and their family history information is still reviewed by a genetic counselor at the sites. And so they will still receive a tailored clinical recommendations letter or information based on their family history. That here are the recommendations that we have for you that are personalized. So even though they test negative, they still may get recommendations based on their family history.
And then any cascade testing for family members who might also benefit?
Yeah, that's it's not part of the trial per se, but it is part of our standard of care. So when people test positive, the genetic counselors who do the return of those results recommend testing of family history or family members through our normal standard of care processes. Yes, we would love to be able to expand and be able to focus a little more on cascade genetic testing as well.
Do you think your model, including algorithm for recruiting patients, plus the use of the chatbot with the EHR, could be leveraged in a precision oncology clinical trial to return secondary variant risk findings to clinical trial participants?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The infrastructure, although we are applying it to this specific use case that leverages family history to identify people who meet criteria for genetic testing, you can think about other use cases where, any use case where you're looking at a population and you want to find the people who meet certain criteria. You want to do something with them, you want to outreach and provide specific kind of care, could fit in this kind of infrastructure. The main thing is that the specific algorithm would have to be developed for that particular use case. So basically, the algorithm that would find the target population you're interested in.
Great. What happens in workflow when a patient does not complete the pre-test chat and leaves the chat before getting the question that at the end asks how they'd like to proceed?
Yeah, so we are monitoring when people start the chat but don't complete it, and what will happen in that case is that they will be contacted by a genetic counseling assistant who will, after a few weeks, they will be prompted to go back to the chat, but if they do not complete it, the genetic counseling assistant will contact them, try to encourage them to do the chat, but if they don't, they are also offered a genetic counseling appointment so that if they're interested, they can still get that information. I think a related point also is if they do not start the chat at all, we also do outreach through the genetic counseling assistants so that they are aware of the information and that they may potentially benefit through genetic evaluation.
Does the algorithm tell the medical team whether the patient meets criteria, or does it specifically say which criteria are met and which testing should be ordered?
Yeah, it does. Number one is binary. Does the patient meet criteria or not? And that makes the patient be exported to the registry. But in that export, you also have the rationale. It's what exactly in the patient's family history made that patient meet criteria. And that's displayed in that population management dashboard that I showed. It does not tell which genetic tests to perform.
And how about on the patient side? Does GIA explain why they met criteria, or was there a message in the portal, patient portal, that told them why they met criteria?
Yeah, so the pretest chat does not identify why they met criteria. It's general, so it could be the same chat could be given to everybody. But in the information that they get from the genetic counselors, so the recommendations, it would be more tailored to their specific family history and genetic risk, if that's applicable.
Are the participants told when to expect test results in both arms? And is there a time delay for receiving either the negative or positive results from the chat box or genetic counselor?
Yeah, so they are given a time frame either by the genetic counseling assistant if they're in the intervention arm, the patient-directed arm, or by the genetic counselor if they're in our standard of care arm. And then the timing of the post-test chat is based on when we receive the results back. And so within our workflow, it would generally be a few weeks between when people send their sample in and when they would receive the post-test chat or be contacted for a positive or VUS return by genetic counseling.
Will the electronic health record infrastructure take into account updates to the family history and rerun that algorithm to determine if their risk changes over time?
Yeah, very good question too. Basically, we thought this very carefully. The way we approached updates is basically every week we run our algorithms against the entire target population. So if there are changes to family history, let's say a patient did not meet criteria, they come to the clinic on Monday, and they may collect family history, they add, okay, patient had an aunt with early onset breast cancer. By Sunday, the algorithm will run again, we'll evaluate that patient, and we'll find the patient does meet criteria and we'll add to the registry. So we're not running this incrementally. We run against the entire population every week.
How is the family history information stored within the EHR? Are you mining text in the clinical notes, or is it part of standard structure?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's both. At least in Epic, and also we're finding the same thing in Cerner, there is a dedicated family history section in the EHR that allows a collection of family history in a structured format. And that has been our primary target. And currently, all the pilot we've done, everything was done using this kind of structured data. The medical assistants are the primary users of that section. But we also have providers writing family history in the notes. And so we are now developing natural language processing algorithms to extract family history documentation from the notes. But that's a work in progress.
Is GIA only available in English? And if so, do you have plans to expand language options?
Yeah, great question. So at the moment, our chats are only in English. We do plan to translate into Spanish. And we have considered other languages, although I think outside the scope of our trial. But I think that is one of the advantages of the chat platform, that it could certainly be offered in other languages once the translation is done.
Do you have any data from any of the pilot testing that talks about how patients respond and like using the chatbot?
We've done user testing, although more just usability testing. So generally, people who have done the user testing have liked the platform, even in some cases, people who thought they wouldn't like the platform. We have just launched the pilot within the University of Utah healthcare system with actual primary care patients. So very shortly, we should have more data. But at least the initial user testing has been really promising in that people like using the chat, and that they generally complete it. They don't start it and then not complete it.
It looks like you've developed several interfaces into Epic. Do you feel that integrating that into Epic is easier now than it has been in the past?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Just overall, other EHRs, I think it's a similar situation. There's been slowly but increased adoption of APIs. There are proprietary APIs that we have been able to access for some time, but now an increasing number of APIs that are compliant with the FHIR standard. It's still work in progress. A small subset of the FHIR standard has been adopted. There are APIs that do not expose all the data we need, so sometimes we have to create our own APIs. But I think that the gist of the situation is that it's been improving. Basically, every release of the EHR, we see expansion of FHIR adoption.
It sounds like a fair amount of your process is driven by your genetic counseling assistants in the intervention arm. Can you speak to how these individuals are trained and if they already existed within your system?
Yeah, that's a great question. They did exist in the University of Utah healthcare system at Huntsman. It is a type of position that NYU has actually added as part of the trial, and so they are testing out adding a genetic counseling assistant approach. They're trained by the genetic counselors, and that work is overseen by the genetic counselors. But the genetic counseling assistants are able to take on some of the time-consuming tasks that don't necessarily require the highly specialized knowledge of the counselors. So doing the patient outreach calls, talking to patients about insurance and billing, and it potentially frees up the genetic counselors then to have the more specialized tasks of reviewing the information and generating recommendations. But it has certainly been a real advantage to have those positions at the Huntsman Cancer Institute, and it is really critical to making the trial work.
And so with this algorithm, the hope is you identify more patients that are at risk and need to see genetic counselors. And so how is that workflow impacted with the genetic counselors and the work volume?
Sorry, could you just repeat the last part of that question?
Sorry. So understanding that, you've taken some impact off the genetic counselors, but also knowing you're hoping to identify more patients that need those services by identifying those that potentially are at risk, how is this workflow impacting the genetic counselors' overall workflow and burden, and do you have enough counselors to sustain the increase in volume?
Yes, a really great question. It's one thing we're monitoring during the trial. So far, at least in the pilot stages, we've been able to integrate them into the workflow of our genetic counselors. At Huntsman, we have 8 and possibly 9 genetic counselors, and so there's a good deal of genetic counseling workforce. But it is something that we are actively monitoring. We are hoping, if this approach is successful, to be able to work, once the trial ends, to contact this large pool of patients and try to reach all of them. And so it's actively something we're looking at in the trial. But at least so far in the pilot stage, we've been able to integrate within the normal genetic counseling workflow.
And we'll end with this question. It says, I'm intrigued by new uses of the platform. Could you speculate on 2 or 3 new patient population scans that you think could be promising using this technology?
So patient population, we've been just brainstorming options. I mean, one of them, for example, if you can have more advanced algorithms using, for example, artificial intelligence integrating EHR data with imaging data, you could have a platform that scans for records, trying to find people who may have signs of early cancer in those images. Another possibility is finding, this would be in primary care, and you could have people with chronic conditions who are most likely to have to end up in the emergency department or be hospitalized because of, let's say, low adherence to their medication treatments. Basically, any kind of population that needs some kind of special care that's tailored to their needs could benefit from this kind of approach.
Great. Just offer any last comments by either of our speakers before we close out the webinar.
Well, thank you all for the great questions. We've enjoyed the discussion, and thank you again to the National Cancer Institute for hosting.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your great questions that you submitted. If you did not get your question answered, or if you have any additional questions that you'd like to get answered, please refer to the email addresses up on your screen at the moment. And again, thank you, everyone, for your participation. And like I said earlier, this webinar has been recorded, and it will be posted online in the coming weeks. So thank you again.